Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Michael. A whole other week has passed, and here we are again. How has the week been, and what's in store for us today?
Yeah, well, my week's much the same as usual, Jackie. Nice and steady. Can't complain. Health's been pretty good. So, yeah, I'm travelling well. So hello to you. Hello to all our listeners. And I'd like to think that everyone's had a pretty good week and is pretty travelling well as well. Um, I would have just loved to have got some feedback, Jackie, from last week's podcast when I asked the people for their exercise to observe 8 billion people on the planet and see what they were doing with their lives. Well, unfortunately, I realise I can't get that feedback, but I've explained to you in other times that I've got extra sort of perceptive powers,
Of course.
and I know, I'm pretty sure what most people observed that 8 billion people were doing on the planet. All right. So we can.
Have you got a comment about that? A summary? What's your note? What's the notables?
Well, I think they would have observed that, tying in with the material as to whether people are living godly or ungodly lives, they would have observed that a majority of people, from what they can see around the world, are not living godly lives. So by definition, it means they're living ungodly lives, which, again, by definition means it's going to be causing them some grief or stress or heartache in their lives. So all this material we've been looking at, Jackie, for now, what are we up to? Podcast 33 is talking about all of this constantly in one form or another, in one way of describing it in a chapter. But this chapter in particular, which I said at the start to everyone, is a slightly different chapter in that it solely focuses very clearly and very strongly on these two aspects of human behaviour, simply godly or ungodly, which I'll elaborate on in this episode. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll continue on. So we continue today, Jackie and listeners, with podcast 33, which concludes part 2 of chapter 16, which is differentiating between the good or godly and the bad or the ungodly. And that's focusing on particularly the person's personalities, behaviours or traits of human beings. So that's what the focus is all about. In Sanskrit, this chapter is called The Way of Divine and Demonic Destinies and references many stories of the battles between the devas, that is the gods, and the asuras, that is the demons in the astral realms. So this chapter, gets covers that aspect in a fair amount of detail as well. But here in this part of the teaching, Gita, when he's discussing, when Krishna, I should say, in the Gita is discussing the divine or demonic qualities, he's not speaking of gods or demons in the astral realms, but he's speaking of human good and evil. So in other words, we could call it the battle between Buddhi and the ego, or simply the two wolf story that you shared earlier in the podcast between feeding the good wolf or feeding the bad wolf. Whichever one we feed and nourish, that's the one that grows stronger, and the other one, because it's not getting enough food, starts to diminish in strength and power. So so as he did in chapter 1, when he urged Arjuna to fight a righteous war against the unrighteous forces of life in order to save his own soul. So the reference to the 8 billion people, what they're all doing, they're not fighting very strongly, if at all, to save their own soul in this battle of life. He says the demonic court in the demonic aspect, and it's been focusing heavily on the people who aren't turning their attention to God, meaning aren't accessing the universal truths from the great masters. Either got no knowledge at all or ignoring it. And he says, these demonic beings are caught in the web of delusion, perplexed by discordant thoughts, entangled in the snare of desires, infatuated by passion, intoxicated by wealth, obstinate and proud. They become consumed with hate, malice and slander. Not sounding good, is it, Jackie?
Not sounding good at all.
They thereby hate me in themselves and also in others. Because they have fully given themselves to the darkness of egoism, they become more entangled in the nets of their own making, of desires and attachments, the weight of which drag them down into the quicksand of hell. The references to hell, Jackie, and listeners, is not down there and heaven up there. Hell and heaven are internal. They're inside each being. And depending on whether you're feeding the bad wolf, well, you're going to find yourself in a state of hell, your own making. And if you feed the good wolf, you feel in a heavenly blissful state, peaceful and contented. It's simple in the fact that you can only be operating one or the other. That's all anyone can do, Jackie, on the planet. If you choose to feed the bad wolf, well, you go with what goes with that. If you choose to feed the good wolf, well, you get what goes with that. It involves karma and life cycles and all of those sorts of things, but that's it in a nutshell. And, I understand that we've all got different desires, Jackie, and aims and whatever, and the families and where you live and what your financial position is and all sorts of these things all across the world. And so they're all mitigating factors. But the people listening to these podcasts, you and me included, that are involved in it, we've sort of got an escape hatch. We're not desperate like many people are on the planet. So we've got an opportunity to be accessing this material, listening to these podcasts, reading these sorts of books, and getting the knowledge and understanding to be able to make fundamental changes in our lives. So we've put ourselves in a very, very profitable situation, if you like. It bodes us well. And even if it's only early days on our spiritual journey, at least you're on it, which majority of people aren't. So, then once you're on it, you just want to get more knowledge, and as you understand more, you want to stay on it and keep progressing on the journey of truth. So when we descend into the quicksands of hell, a hell of their own making, he says, those who hate me are cruel, and those who hate me, who are cruel, the dregs of mankind, I condemn them karmically to a continuous, miserable, and godless rebirth. Time after time, according to their karma, I cast these malicious evildoers into the wombs of like-minded parents. There's a cycle in the parents and the children that go with them, which is a very lengthy sort of topics, but it's just not willy-nilly or coincidence. It's all part of each individual's karmic aspect. And when he says I cast them and things like that, it's not like God's doing it. He says, because of my laws, that's inevitably what happens. Yeah, they cast themselves into these godless cycles, life after life. So life after life, they take birth in similar degradation without ever reaching me or even turning towards me. So that's 90% of the world's population, and that includes many good people and so on. I'm not saying every one of those 90% is this degraded sort of being, but it simply means they still fall in that category, that they're not looking towards the truth. So anyone not looking towards the truth, and this will be spelled out very clearly, Jackie and listeners, in the last chapter, the next chapter we do to conclude the work. And I'll just jump in early. He makes it clear. He says, look, Arjun, I've taught you this way of living, and I've taught you this, and I've taught you this, and I've taught you that. He says, we're getting to the end of it all now. So he says, when push comes to shove, there's only two sorts of being on this planet. Two groups, Jackie, listeners. He says, there's the group that's seeking me, and there's the group not seeking me. End of story. Simple. Okay? And he doesn't care if you're just even peeping and, looking down the horizon and thinking, who's that down there? He says you're a seeker. Anyone who's making any effort, meditating, reading a spiritual book of some substance, is turning towards God. You don't have to be, a sage or a saint or fully realised. He's including anyone that's showing any interest, even thinking about it. He's saying you're the one, you're seeking me. Is that clear, Jackie?
That's
So,
clear.
it's, he's outlining here the doom and the gloom for people who are willfully or ignorantly, just through, too much going on in their lives, not accessing the truth and just explaining this is what will happen in their lives. This teaching of Krishna's isn't like the 10 Commandments. He doesn't say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. In his teaching, Krishna does it beautifully. He just says to Arjuna, which is representative of all human beings, these are the laws of my creation. These are my rules. And you'll find that if you follow them, you will live a very happy, contented life and eventually join me. And he says, if you don't follow them, well, you'll find yourself in your self-created hell of any sort of temperature you like, just a little bit in hell or a lot in hell or totally in hell. Yeah. So he keeps just saying, this is the knowledge, this is what you need to do, and you've got a choice because I gave you the free will, which I've given to no other creature in the universe, just human beings, and exercise that free will appropriately. All right, we'll continue on, Jackie. So he says, such souls cannot seem to purify their sinful hearts, repeating the same selfish ways, they sink lower and lower into the worst possible depths. Now, this is a bleak picture, Jackie and listeners, which I've already sort of touched on, which in the Gita dwells on only in this chapter. So all the other chapters have been much more on a positive note, haven't they? This one still has got positive aspects in it, but it's clearly outlining, so the people who have got this far, saying very clearly, reminding all of the seekers, be careful, learn from your mistakes, because if the alternative is you'll fall backwards into the mortal existence. You get caught up by the ego. And you made a reference last week. You said, it's been a bit of a hellish week, really. You mightn't have used the word, but there was a bit of turmoil and drama and whatever. So that's that aspect of instantly you were saying that, thinking, well, ego's got there and it's got Jackie by the scruff of the neck and giving her a bit of a shake. So, but this is what happens to every human being. But the idea is that that little wake up shake is beneficial in that you could reflect on what it was that you being got caught up in at that time and immersed in, got sucked into it, instead of standing back and being the observer to it. Is not always easy. I understand all that, been there, done that, but that's the aim of it all. So so I was saying here that it's a bleak picture that's been painted here. But even here amongst the gloom of hellish life cycles, Krishna reminds Arjuna that each individual always has the choice to change direction and become more godly. And I've just spent a few minutes discussing that, Jackie. And he also reminds Arjuna and all of us that despite what happens to the body, the mind, the emotions, and so on, the soul, the Atman, continues to remain pure, perfect, and complete. Nothing that the mortal part of the being does has any impact or tarnishes the soul. Same as that then can't tarnish God. We're totally separate, even though he's in us. He doesn't get involved in our individual human, not nonsense or whatever that we get caught up in. So finally, Krishna stresses to Arjuna that the three main causes of this depravity are desires, anger, and greed. And they're called very clearly through the teaching. Anyone's got a Gita, you'll see it there, the three gates to hell. And Krishna warns Arjuna. He says, any one of these alone is enough to bind you to this darkness. So abandon all three. Everyone's life on this planet, Jackie, is 100% fueled by desires. The reason anger and greed comes into it is that they're all related. If the desires are met, the person invariably wants more of them. So they become greedy. More money, more power, more this, more that. If the desires aren't met, what are called thwarted, you deny them for one reason or another, well, then that leads to anger. The person gets frustrated, angry. So then they get less calm, they get more impatient, more intolerant. All of those qualities, they're all aspects of anger. But it's summarised under those three headings: desires, anger, and greed, and they all link together. They're not separate entities. Right? So if you've got a desire for the truth, you have not much anger, if any, and there's no greed. You're satisfied with what you've got. You realise that that's all you need, really. If people were happy with what they needed, they'd have a much more happier life. But most of us always want a bit more. You want a nicer car, a bigger car, a nicer wife or husband, a bigger house, want a pool, you want a jet, you want a helicopter, and tennis court, and a yacht, and you want this and you want that, and you want all endless things. All right, so I'll continue on, otherwise I'll get too sidetracked there, Jackie. So he's saying one must forsake at all costs not to enter these gates. So he's really stressing, don't go down that path. And in the Bible, it talks about wide is the road and wide is the gate. That's where most of the people are walking down, all fueled by desires. And then there's the reference to narrow is the road and narrow is the gate. And that's for a smaller stream of people heading down the gate of truth. The other gates, it's got really three gates: desires, greed, and anger there. So he says, one must forsake, I think I said that, at all costs not to enter these gates. The person who enters will not only fail to reach life's final goal, nor achieve any measure of lasting happiness, but will instead continue on these three demonic roads, which lead to self-destruction and inferno. Inferno there obviously relating to the reference of hell, the fires of hell. One of my favourite songs, Jackie, Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire.
I do know that is one of your favourite songs, yes.
Listeners, it's one of my favourite songs. If you ever get a chance, or you can just press the buttons on your computer and say Johnny Cash, Ring of Fire, listen carefully to the words. I'll just repeat a few words. He says, bound by wild desires. Yeah? Bound by wild desires, Jackie. Bondage, the chains of, the three gunas. Bound by wild desires, I fell into a burning ring of fire. And then he says, down, 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 and the flames leapt higher. Yeah? So there's Johnny Cash, a country and western singer, but he was actually a very spiritual man. But he's talking about these three gates of hell. And in a lovely song that most people have probably heard of countless times, but never listened carefully to the words. And even if they had, not understanding them in the context of this material that we're discussing. All right. So he says, in the last three verses now, Jackie and listeners, we turn into a more positive sort of aspect of it. In the last three verses of the chapter, Krishna stresses to Arjuna the importance of the teachings of the great sacred scriptures and texts. Stresses to Arjuna how important this material is, which these podcasts are based on, one of the greatest of them all. He tells him that the function of these spiritual scriptures is to guide people towards living a perfect life on earth, perfect in inverted commas, meaning you're happy and contented, less stressed and so on. That's what, not meaning you don't have to necessarily be a saint in that sense, but perfect in that you're following the laws and your life's getting better and better until eventually you will achieve that final perfection. And he says that in the next line, and repeatedly reminds them, the teachings, of achieving the divinity itself. So there's steps towards perfection for anyone that's on their spiritual journey, and then there's the final step of what's called self-realization or enlightenment. All right, Jackie?
Mm-hmm.
But those who neglect, abandon, or ignore this spiritual wisdom, either unknowingly or willfully, some people start on it and then they sort of say, "Oh no, this is rubbish," and they turn their back on it. Not just these podcasts, but reading the Bible, the teachings of Jesus, or Hermes Trismegistus, or Buddha, or anyone. Have a look at it, but it's like the saying that it's a fountain of wisdom. Most people come and they just gargle, get a bit of a taste, and then spit it out. Others come and they actually drink. So there's a big difference of who visits the fountain of truth. But he says those who neglect the wisdom willingly or unknowingly or willfully and continue to follow their egoic impulse of desires and passion, they attain neither happiness nor perfection nor the highest goal, and will continue their lives with much suffering and misery. And Sri Ramakrishna in his makes the comment in one of the Gitas where he just puts it in two simple lines. He says, "Those merely of a mortal mould only are base and vulgar, but the spiritual kind strive for spiritual eminence." So that's that reference I was making in the last chapter. It'll just say two lots of people. One will be basically base and vulgar, meaning just living mortal lives in the world of Maya, the world of illusion, and others are seeking their divine life, wanting to connect with Purusha or consciousness or God, and they're striving for spiritual eminence. We're doing all right, Jackie.
That is good.
Just looked at the watch. I've only got one more page and then a few little stories to tidy it all up. So I'll give you an opportunity to speak, Jackie, in about 10 lines when I just make this little section. So therefore, Krishna continues explaining to Arjuna, "Let the scriptures be your authority," he says, "with the great sages and seers guiding your conduct in ascertaining what ought to be done and what ought not to be done. Having sought the highest light of wisdom and learned the injunctions declared in them, one should live one's life accordingly in this world, knowing what the right choices are." And Jackie and listeners, it's simpler than you might think. We're sort of talking lots of words here over the 33 podcasts so far and the 40 when we finish. And they're all telling us important lessons. But it says here very simply how it works and what the outcome will be. He says, when you or anyone is on the spiritual journey, there is no conflict at all between what you do and what the scriptures advise. So as we change from our mortal egoic-driven lives to following the teachings of any of the great masters, including Krishna, of course, well then what we're doing in our life, how we're thinking, speaking and acting is no different to what we're learning in this regard. The two go hand in glove. And that's that notion that's in the Christian teaching of thy will be done, not my will. So while the being's chasing I, me and mine, well then that's egoic. When they say thy, well then it becomes spiritual, divine. So anything you'd like to reflect on there, Jackie? I've sort of gone through a fair bit, but is it, we've got time if you've got something to say or ask or.
I just can't help but wonder. I mean, they're very beautiful, high-level spiritual concepts. I'm always interested in the reality for the common person, myself included. I can't help but wonder if a lot of people feel, particularly if they're newish on the journey, feel inspired to a large degree by all of the teachings, but also have that reminder of the forgetfulness and how easy it is to fall back into, human desires and perhaps ways of behaving in life that don't necessarily serve themselves well. Like there's a big leap, isn't there, in coming to understand the teachings but actually living your life in that way. You know, when fear comes or serious health concerns come to people, like I suppose, you know, using health an example, if someone faces a, you know, a life-threatening thing, understanding karma, reincarnation, you know, all of these teachings is very useful. But I'm very curious about the gap that's in between, where people start to really put this into play. You know, someone who's facing something life-threatening, obviously they're going to feel immense fear and worry and concern that they're going to die ahead of their time, or what they perceive as their time, and all of these things. So I suppose as you're speaking, I'm just constantly reminded of how can we all remind ourselves of when the going really gets tough? How do we sort of start to integrate these high ideals that are beautiful, and you explain them well. I think the majority of our listeners grasp the concept. But, you know, there feels often a very big gap between an ordinary person who's learning this information and how they start to bridge that. Um, I'm aware that's probably the biggest question of all time, because you know, for anyone on the spiritual path, really we're looking for the answers in that regard. But I feel like it's worth giving voice to, because as people listen to you, you know, these are very high ideals, and I'm sure some people might be feeling like, oh, it's really hard. You know, I do worry about health, or I do worry about money, or I do worry about this, and you know, maybe the ego gets the better of me from time to time. Um, any words of inspiration for the common folk?
Well, what about next year? We do 40 podcasts on answering that question, Jackie.
Ooh, this cycle of 40 might be, you know,
No, well, I
taking
mean,
the time and
well,
energy.
all I mean by that is join the
It
club.
goes forever.
It's a question that everyone asks, you know, or especially when they wake up. And in early stages, there's you know a lot of things I could say, but I'd like to sort of get back onto the material for the last little bit. But simply, a couple of references like that just spring to mind instantly was you're talking about giving the example of someone, say, that's got a life threatening issue, and they're worrying about what you mentioned, what happens when I die. My life's going to be cut short and that. Well, we've talked about that in the material, that person, if they've got enough knowledge and understanding, would be able to draw and get some sort of relief for themselves in understanding that who dies, what dies. So if they understand that the body dies, and they understand that why the body has got this illness in this lifetime, even if you don't understand fully where it's originated from, but understanding the cycles of birth and death, that's inevitably is there. And it's not a mistake. The great computer doesn't make mistakes. Everything, as you sow, so you shall reap. We don't know what we've done in previous lifetimes to say, oh, why is this happening? I've been good this lifetime. So how come I've got this illness? So that's one aspect quickly. Knowing that individual knows that their personality continues on into the next lifetime. The only other thing I'd add in here quickly, Jackie, for you and everyone else, is to remember that when we're on this spiritual journey, we spend many, many lifetimes improving and improving and improving. So it means it's constantly that notion of, one step forward, two steps back, two steps forward, three steps back. It's sort of a constant life cycle after life cycle where we're just gradually going up. You can't do it in one lifetime. Don't be worried, you or anyone, Jackie, if you don't accomplish it, realization in this lifetime. Most likely, hardly anyone will. Yeah, maybe one if we're would achieve self-realization. So, but you take solace from the fact that you can see your life getting better gradually in this lifetime, which tells you that it's working, and that should give you enough hope and encouragement to put that seed into your karmic USB stick, or type it in, that the rest of this lifetime and next lifetime, if I'm going to have one, I want to continue on my spiritual journey. We don't have to be saying the words, listeners, but just if you keep doing this for the rest of your life, reading material, watching podcasts, meditating, trying to calm the mind down, trying to control the senses, all of those things, well, you are indicating and you're putting in onto your USB stick that this is one of my desires, a fundamental desire. So that's a lot different to the mortal desires that you've had there as well. So you're throwing some of them out one way or another, and you're making a stronger desire for the truth. So everything sorts itself out, Jackie and listeners. Don't be worried about it. And you're not meant to worry about it. It'll do your head in. It'll explode. Just listen, and I've just read out that if one listens to the great masters, the seers and the sages, and makes choices to change their life, you will be traveling in the right direction and the outcome will come sooner or later. All right?
And it's the integration, isn't it? I think that's what
Yes.
I'm reminded of
Yeah.
hearing you speak,
Yeah.
because the knowledge is one thing, but the knowledge itself isn't necessarily going to bring solace to someone facing extreme hardship or circumstance.
No.
It's the way in which people can integrate that into lives, which actually is the part that I would say offers the most relief and or comfort for people, like a release of the pressure valve.
Yeah. I've called my sessions and that at different times, but even if I don't call them that in material when I hand it out, trying to attract new people to the groups. Behind it all, I know that it's a fundamental, practical, spiritual philosophy. And I've mentioned on a number of these podcasts, and the teachings has as well. The knowledge, as important as it is probably about 10% of what the person needs. The other 90% is exactly what you're describing and asking about. It's the putting that knowledge into practice. Remember, there was the whole chapter talking about or a couple of chapters, talking 2 chapters on action, and then saying when we perform the right action, that will turn us into wiser people. We're putting it into practice. So without, if it's just knowledge and no practical aspect to it, no putting it into practice, no making changes in the way you think and behave and talk and act and so on, it's like, I've mentioned the story, a donkey carrying a load of holly books. It's all in here, but you're not doing anything with it. The donkey can't do anything with that material, even though he's got Bibles and works of Plato and Buddha and so on strapped on his back. And so a human being that's doing that is just still like a donkey. They might know it all intellectually and repeat everything much better than I can and so on, but aren't putting it into their everyday lives. So in a sense, it's a fair bit wasted, but not totally. Eventually, that being, of course, the penny will drop and it'll sink in. But it's that saying that we have, 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. That's what it sums up.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good.
Okay, so I'll just continue on here. So Krishna concludes chapter 16 in a positive note. In summary, he explains to Arjuna how the divine and spiritual seekers, conquering their ignorance-based desires, free themselves from these triple gates of hell, desire, anger, and greed. He says, those who finally pass by these 3 dark gates and turn Godward live in peace and happiness. So that sums up a lot of the question you asked. You live in, turn to God and your life will start to turn around. And even if you've got a lifelong illness, you'll turn around in that you'll be able to deal with it much better than a person who's got a lifelong illness and hasn't got any truthful knowledge. They will suffer infinitely more greatly. So he says, having turned towards me and put their energy and devotion on me, realizing the follies that accompany living a demonic life, they can progress more rapidly along the path of truth until they finally reach the supreme goal, and that's enlightenment. And I'd put to you and Jackie and listeners that this is what we're all doing, is it not? To some extent or other, Jackie. Okay. And so I just got a few minutes, Jackie. That's the end of the material. But I'd just like to finish the session off by sharing 2 or 3 little very brief stories, Jackie, that will help illustrate this chapter a bit more clearly, I guess, and more simply. So these little simple stories can be used to illustrate this chapter, which has depicted the seekers of truth gradually transforming as they progress on their spiritual journey. Yeah, gradually transforming. So this is the question, the fundamental question you just asked, with lots of other little questions in there, and what the teaching's all giving answers to. The person having to change or realizing they want to change, and then taking steps through the knowledge of the great masters as to how they can make these changes. Now, I've got three little three and then four for the humans. But I've already shared on a number of instances, and everyone would be familiar with the simple analogy of a caterpillar, a grub caterpillar, spinning a cocoon, staying in there for a while, and in there's a fundamental change takes place. Metamorphosis is the label to it. And when that process finishes, it eats its way out, and it's a beautiful butterfly. So it starts a grub and it comes out a butterfly. So then there's a little analogy in a similar vein, using a plant instead of insect or an animal. A green bud emerges on a plant. You love plants. You looked at the little early on daffodils coming out of the garden, awestruck. How does this happen, and all the rest of it, which is a beautiful observation. So okay, you can everyone's seen this. A green bud emerging on a plant. You watch it over the next few days, and you see it start to open up a bit, and there's a little tinge of colour. Then you watch it over the next few days, and it fully opens, and it's a beautiful flower. And in that beautiful flower, there's a perfume starts to emanate and waft around. And then if you're observing, you'll see that a bee will come along and land on that perfume, on that flower. The perfume attracts it, and then it can eat the nectar or suck on the nectar. Yeah. This truth is called the nectar of truth. Then I deviate a little bit here, and I go to bees and blowflies. Everyone's probably going to be a bit disappointed, Jackie, because they were thinking I might say bees and the birds and the bees. But no, we're going to stick with bees and blowflies for this little story. We all know bees and we all know blowflies. A lovely way of illustrating the difference between people or anyone that can discriminate, in other words, use their buddhi, their highest spiritual aspect, for those who can't use their buddhi and discriminate. So the ones who can't discriminate, human beings, they will continue having hellish lives to some extent or other, continuously until they learn to discriminate. So if you're not discriminating by buddhi, and that's the only part of us that can discriminate, I've touched on that many times, Jackie, then you're operating from ego, which has got no chance of discriminating. Doesn't know what's true or not true, what's right, what's wrong, what's godly, what's ungodly. It'll just keep hammering the being. Now, stick with me, listen to what I'm saying, you'll be all right, mate, everything will be good. So the blowfly, we all know, has got no ability to discriminate. I walk along the beach here, Jackie, and the responsible dog owners sometimes aren't so responsible and leave their dog droppings there. When you approach, you'll be 50 blowflies will arise from there and buzz around all over. Those blowflies will sit on a dead corpse and eat it. They'll also come to your barbecue and sit on the pavlovas on the outside and put their feet in it and that, and on the chops and sausages. They'll land on your face and on your skin and so on. They'll land and try and eat anything at all. They don't care. The bee, on the other hand, it only gets drawn to a garden of aroma, the perfume of all the flowers. And it'll only land on flowers and drink their nectar, all right? I've never seen 50 bees fly up from a pile of dog droppings when I'm walking along. Don't know if you have or anyone else has. If you have, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. They won't do it. They can discriminate just in their own little sort of way. So that leads me then on to humans. Humans can learn to discriminate. The bees, it's a natural thing. For blowflies, it's a natural thing. So we can't blame the blowflies that they haven't been given the ability, and neither have the bees. But just by their nature as insects, one lot can do anything and one lot will only do one certain thing. Human beings have got the ability to discriminate, to develop and train and use their buddhi, and so they can discriminate using buddhi between godly and ungodly thoughts, words and actions. All right, Jackie? So do you think those little stories might have helped just clear that whole chapter up a bit?
I think so. I think the caterpillar and butterfly one is one people will feel strongly attached to because it's one of beauty. And I think we can all probably relate in that there's times in life where we've felt that sort of change and transformation take place, which is always exciting and wondrous if you're going through it, heartening if you're recalling times and remembering how good that felt. And I think it instills a sense of hope in that transformation process is continually possible.
Yeah. Well, in just those few sentences there, you've answered your own question that you're asking, 5 minutes ago. The whole material, the whole book, the whole teachings of all the great masters is to firstly just open us up to the fact that we're a godly being, and then remind us, and then take us step by step through whatever the teaching is, gradually over many lifetimes. To keep practicing and perfecting and get it all under control. So don't you or anyone listeners be disheartened. As I've said to you on many occasions, anyone listening, especially to this stage now, is well and truly on their path. Last week's podcast, Krishna made it clear, and I drew everyone's attention to it. That he's saying to Arjuna, you're asking questions, Arjuna. You're talking to me. You're wanting to know about me. You're growing more in love with me. So therefore, you're a godly being. So he says, don't be concerned what I'm saying now in this rest of the chapter. It's for people who aren't to either eventually help them wake up. But he mentioned also in there, Jackie and listeners, that it's a reminder to us, hearing what I've just read out and what I read out last week's podcast, as to this is what most of the world's doing. This is what we used to do fully. And now we're not doing that. And we need to acknowledge that we're making positive steps, that we're wanting to become more godly. And we are doing that. And we can tell what the result is. Yeah. Last week you didn't have a very good week, so you recognise that that was that reference 2 steps back. Yeah. Today or this week you've had a much better week, and these podcasts and whatever, a constant reminder that we need this knowledge. We need to be reminded. No one's understanding all this and will remember all this. These 40 podcasts. They'll have to revisit one way or another person on another podcast, read some more books. But it's a continuing process. So all I can say, folks, to finish up is you're all turning towards God, one way or another. Even the person that very hesitantly started on the podcast 1. So that's all God wants from us, expects from us, and he knows that if once you start, you will keep going until you accomplish the ultimate goal of unity with him. All right. So just quick, Jackie, the exercise, very simple. I just want anyone that's doing the exercise, observe whenever you can during the week, whether you've been operating as a blowfly or a bee in whatever activity has just taken place. Yeah. In other words, whether it was egoic or whether you were using discriminative buddhi. Is that all right, Jackie?
That's all right.
Any final comments you want to
No, I think the practicing of discernment is an excellent thing, and we'll all be a lot happier for it when we've got our discerning tools sharpened. Comes in very useful in life.
Good, Jackie. Oh, that's beautiful words that I'm hearing you say. All right, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to share with you. Travel well. I hope your week is a beautiful week, and we will share with you again next week.
Yep,
all right. Bye for now.
Likewise here. Bye.